Come on in the room. You are in the right place at the right time. Come on in. Hello, 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 hello. Well, listen, welcome to our virtual town hall discussion. And here is where we are going to unpack police misconduct in the mass incarceration of Black men in America. Is that all right? Okay, so yes, I am your host and moderator, Dr. Dwan Bryant. I'm the CEO of D. Bryant Enterprises, all the way from Dallas, Texas, here to serve you. And it is a pleasure and an honor, and I'm absolutely elated to be here for such an important discussion on today. So I'm not alone. I am joined by an amazing panelist with an expertise and insight that will bring more meaning to this discussion on today. So I'm going to introduce them in just a few, but now I want you to really tune in because I am getting ready to set the table. I am getting ready to bring out the entrees of injustice and startling facts that I hope will increase your appetite for change and awareness for this issue and a call to action. So this is what's happening all over the world. We are looking in the media at disturbing news coverage about the misconduct of police and brutality against Black men, innocent Black men and women. And so as a result, in the United States, people are marching, they're demonstrating, they're having protests, and they're lifting their voices against this injustice. I mean, this is a sheer outrage which has reached all over the continent. Everybody knows what's happening right now, the malicious killing of Black men by the police. But what about addressing the other forms of police misconduct that exists in this country that we've yet to shed light on? So have we considered the thousands of Black people who have been killed by the police, such as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but rather incarcerated and sentenced to death in prison due to systemic racism? You know about that word, don't you? Yes, so the purpose of this discussion today is so we can expand our conversation about what is happening right now in our Black community. And these are the untold narratives of thousands of Black men who have been sentenced to die in prison. And we want to look at that broad scope of police misconduct. And you know what? Although we're not hearing it on a daily basis, guess what? Their names, their lives still matter. And today we hope that uniting as a community and these brilliant minds that are on this panel on today, that's going to give their insight, and they're in positions where they can really talk about what they can really add value to this discussion. And so we're hoping that we can create a greater sense of awareness about the racial disparities in our criminal justice system, and a call to action. Yes, a call to action where we demand that we hold the police and the prosecutors accountable for their wicked actions. So right now, I'm bringing it in, but right now, I want you to take a moment and look at this video, this short clip that I want to play before we introduce our panel and start our discussion, so you really get an idea of and a picture of what this looks like. Here's our video.
Mass incarceration means that we've got a very high rate of incarceration historically, comparatively. And the other thing is the rate of incarceration is so high, so socially concentrated, that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups. The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically, it was 100 per 100,000. Now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000. nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about black men who were born in the late 1970s and who were growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event. And that's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated, and that's about 1 in 9. The research shows that kids who experience parental incarceration have diminished school achievement, they have behavioural problems, depressive symptoms, acting out, and there's also evidence that these kinds of negative effects associated with parental incarceration are concentrated more among boys than among girls. And there's a very real risk here that incarceration becomes an inherited trait. The underlying issue is we've chosen prison as a way to respond to that problem of crime. And there are a whole variety of ways that we could have chosen to respond to that problem of crime. We've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty, and we've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty for a historically aggrieved group whose liberty in the United States was never firmly established to begin with.
Thank you for watching the video. And if you're joining us on today, this is our virtual town hall discussion. And so today's event is sponsored by A Life for a Life Urban Initiative, which is a grassroots organization in Michigan committed to advocating for youth and social justice. So now it is time to introduce our amazing panel. We needed each one of these individuals who are well-rounded and informed, and they create a diverse group of educated experts. Wouldn't you agree? So on today, I want to introduce my first guest, Dr. Erica Taylor. She currently serves as the Executive Director of Early Childhood Education for the Saginaw Intermediate School District, where she leads several programs. She's co-chair of the Saginaw Census 2020 Education Committee and co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Would you please give me a warm welcome for Dr. Erica Taylor?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on today.
Thank you. Honor and privilege to be here.
Yes, thank you for your contribution to this discussion. And next, we have Jimmy Green, who is the CEO, president of the Association of Builders and Contractors in the Greater Michigan Construction Academy, companies that advocates, educates, and trains for over 300 builders and contractors in 36 counties, and he is the first Black CEO in ABC's 60-year history, and he has served on several boards and received many awards. He's created training programs for the homeless, those in poverty, and ex-felons. Please help me welcome Jimmy Green.
Thank you, Dr. Bryan. It's always great to see you, even though you are in Dallas. Thank God for FaceTime. I get to see your warm smile. So
yes,
thank you.
Sir.
It's an honor to be here, really, and humbled to be here with this great panel. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much for being here on the panel today, and thank you for the expertise and the value that you're going to add to this discussion. And so next, we have Reverend Dennis LaFoon, who is the influential pastor of Bethel AME Church in Saginaw, Michigan, published writer with the African American Lectionary through Vanderbilt University Divinity School, a distinguished fellow of the Wabash Pastoral Leadership Program sponsored by Lilly Endowment. Would you please help me give a warm welcome to Reverend Dennis LaFoon?
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you on the panel today. And next, we have Dr. Brianne Standifer, who has a passion for health literacy, educational disparities, and health equity. She's earned several awards, and she is the first medical doctor. I want to highlight this. She's the first medical doctor in her family, and she works for the Department of Internal Medicine at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, and selected as chief medical resident for the 2021-2022 year. Would you please give me a warm welcome for Dr. Standifer?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us and being on this panel. Thank you so much. We're excited about your value you're going to add. And next we have Brianna Alexander, and she is a racial justice and racial equity content designer. Her work over the last decade has entered the spaces of local community organizers, businesses, exploring how they think of their commitment to racial equity, foundations seeking to better understand their role in empowering communities and young people, discovering how to be responsible, and I love this, global citizens. Would you please help me give a warm welcome to Brianna Alexander.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us on the panel today and for your time. And last but certainly not least, we have attorney Janae Lamar, who served as an advocate for abused and neglected children, which ultimately led her to her desire to advocate for children as an attorney. She currently manages her law practice, the Lamar Law Firm, PLLC. And attorney Lamar focuses her practice on criminal defense, bankruptcy, family law, and general civil litigation. Would you please help give a warm welcome to attorney Janae Lamar.
Thrilled to be here.
Yes, thank you so much. I am just excited about serving each and every one of you on the panel today, and I am ready to dive right in. And so I want to start the discussion with the one particular term that I mentioned during my intro that many people are talking about. Is internationally known. I mean, it's become rather popular, but we want to know from you as experts in your profession, in your field, what is systemic racism?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to jump in.
Oh, go ahead.
That's probably
Yes,
the
please.
quick reason. Systemic racism, I think that I found it's easiest to understand it as racism that is embedded in policy and practice. So when you think of systemic racism, you think of the sort of policies that ensure people of color aren't hired or elevated at the same rates as other people. So when you think about hair policies, when you think about dress codes that limit earrings, those are the sorts of policies we'd say are systemically racist in nature. Another thing to look at is who is pulled over by the police, and stop and frisk policies and the way that those policies are enforced. There are guidelines. So cops don't just go out into the street with their own ideas alone. They certainly go out of the street with their ideas that inform how they treat the people that they interact with. But there are policies that say that this is what a criminal looks like. And often that person that they're told to criminalize are Black people. And that's what we mean when we talk about systemic racism. Is it's not about the individual and their beliefs, it's about the structure of an institution and how it allows for racialized belief systems to become codified and enforced by an institution's process and procedures.
Thank you. Thank you. And if someone else will join in, thank you. That was an amazing answer. And I think you pretty much summed it up. But how does it work in the criminal justice system? How does it work, that systemic racism? Someone else would just chime in. What does that look like?
I agree with Brianna. I wanted to pop in on what she said too,
Sure.
because I think it's important to catch a couple of the words she said that are so prevalent. The one is embedded,
Yes.
and the other is codified. I don't think people truly understand systemic racism because I think it's so embedded. It's so, I mean, I hate to use this word, but it's so cultural now that I don't even think people recognize it when, even us as Black folks, I think we've come to accept the way things are, and we tend to get past, get over, and in many respects, we almost help to enable it. Because we don't call it out. And it's interesting to me, and I'm so glad you brought that up, Brianna, because it's vitally important that we do a better job at educating what it is without firing brimstone and waiting for the next outrage to happen. I do think there's an important role for us right now to use this as an educational tool and make people cognizant of how it plays out and what it really is, because I think most people would scratch their head and go, gee, I didn't see that, or I didn't recognize that. So I'm glad you said those two words, because that embedded in our culture, and the fact that it's codified right now is hugely problematic. So that was brilliantly said.
Oh, I love it. Yes. And if someone else will just chime in, I mean, what does that even look like? Can we draw a picture verbally of what systemic racism looks like, especially in this day and time? What does that look like?
And so, Duane, you asked about what it looks like in the criminal justice system.
Yes.
Specifically, you have a lot of people of color, especially Black men and women, who cannot necessarily afford access to better, more diligent attorneys. And so, unfortunately, their only option is to, one, represent themselves, or two, they have to go with the court-appointed counsel that is more than likely not going to dedicate the time and effort to actually defending them, you know, when it comes to the criminal charge. Black and brown people, people of color are usually pled out. They plead to a crime just to go ahead and adjudicate the matter. And so there's not necessarily any real justice served when it comes to people of color. And, you know, you're looking at criminal histories, Black and brown people with criminal histories, and those that are suffering collateral consequences of criminal convictions because they just don't have access to better representation.
Yes, awesome, thank you. And you know,
Dr. Bryant,
please.
I wanted to chime in here too, and the way it looks, you know, on a day-to-day basis is the empowerment of Karen. We all know that we have named Karen. I don't know who named Karen, but that's what we have been calling white women specifically, who have been empowered in their privilege to basically do and say what they want to do and say, largely in part with their reports of people of color just doing everyday and ordinary things to the police department. And that's just one of the ways that we have seen specifically recently during this last few weeks to months is just seeing the empowerment of the white woman specifically, that when she calls the police, she knows that they're coming. And if there's a report about Black and brown peoples, she knows that they are coming quickly.
Right. Would anyone else like to? Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So in the educational realm, systemic racism looks like bias test. So the assessments that, you know, it's not a mistake. It's not a shock that many of our students don't do well on the tests that are developed for them, that they are measured by, because they're biased. Many of those tests, even the questions, the content of the questions, some of those things our students are not exposed to, and that's on purpose. That's not a mistake. And so when you look at all of these different tests that, you know, even at the college level, we see that we don't have a lot of teachers of color. Well, they do fine in their classes, but then they can't pass the test. Something's wrong with that. So that's another example of systemic racism as it pertains to education.
And if I could just elongate this conversation in that retrospect, research shows that boys that are placed in special education are likely to have some type of run-in with the criminal justice system. Talk to us about that.
So in school, when we look at, we're talking about mass incarceration.
Yes.
We're looking at how our Black men and Black boys are targeted by police. Mm-hmm. That starts in school. Mm-hmm. When you look at the school system, and I'm not saying anything that I'm guessing. I'm telling you what I've seen as a principal and as a teacher. You can have two kids, Black boy, white boy. They can do the exact same thing. I'll give you an example, horse playing. Right. It's a huge one. When that's reported for that white boy, it's reported as horseplay. Mm-hmm. When it's reported for that Black boy, it's aggression, it's assault.
Yes.
Those things stay on their records. And so it's incumbent upon the administration to make sure that they are paying attention to that. Mm-hmm. Because, and you can see it if you study your data, if you study your suspension data, if you study the data coming from your teachers, you can see it pretty clearly. But you have to be strong enough to say something about it. And so once they're labeled that way, then when staff begins talking with each other and you see some things, it's easy to say, oh, they can't learn. Oh, they can't do this, and then try to put them in special education. So it starts early. And as parents, we have to do a better job at keeping on top of that, because we don't, as parents, ask enough questions. Years ago, if the teacher called you and told you something, our parents, they say, okay, what did they do? I'm dealing with the child. Well, and that's fine. However, we need to get to the point too where we actually question our children and listen to them, because oftentimes they will tell you what's going on, but it's so hard to believe that sometimes we go along with the staff. And let me say, I'm not saying this about every teacher. I'm not saying this about every educator, because I have worked with phenomenal educators, not only Black but white, Hispanic, what have you. But when you sense that something is wrong, and you sense that, if your child is coming home and always getting in trouble, then you need to question that, because what's happening is they're already building a record for that child, yes, even in school, at elementary level.
Wow. Anybody else?
Can I add on to something Erica said?
Yes, please.
So I think the other thing that ties into what Erica said and that school to prison pipeline is that in the state of Michigan, for example, Black and brown children are underdiagnosed for disabilities because they don't have access to medical resources, or they have teachers where normally a referral would be made for evaluation, where instead of the referral for evaluation being made, they're sent to detention, or they're sent to some sort of punitive measure that doesn't actually assess whether or not there's a need for any sort of assistive technology or disability service. And so when you have a lack of resources directed at communities of color, that too is often a symptom of systemic racism that we don't talk enough about. We don't talk enough about how the assumption that students of color aren't also students with disabilities results in a lack of access to things that ensure their future success. You see that play out in whose water is cleaned up when it's contaminated versus whose water isn't cleaned up. And then the through line is that often the contaminated water leads to more disabilities concentrated in communities of color, where then young people are acting out because they need assistance caused by an environmental disaster that was never addressed because it was happening to Black and brown people and not white people. So I think the connections are undoubtable. It's when you don't deal with one thing, the prison system is there as this convenient outcome. And also we want people in prison because people benefit from that. And so I think You know, it's all related, and we don't often talk enough about the relationships between these institutions and the intentionality behind producing the high incarceration outcomes that we see.
Wow. Would anyone else want to, before we, I mean, this information is astounding. I mean, really what we're seeing that's happening in the educational system, because I mean, what I've noticed is I see at a higher rate of Black boys being placed in special education because of being misunderstood. Honestly, when we are given those assessments, then we almost dig into their backgrounds and see what we can find. That, and this is not every, you know, educator, every sis, so I don't want anybody to misunderstand me, but we almost dig in the background and see what we can find that that could possibly be a barrier for them of learning, and we turn it into a negative, and then ultimately it leads them down a road to incarceration, because we've already marked them. We said, well, they can't learn, well, we don't really need them in society. So let's talk about that.
So Dr. Bryant, you just said something about digging into their background. And when we think about how when something happens to our Black men and our Black boys, and the first thing the media does is to go into their background to say, oh, well, they were this, oh, well, they were that. That starts in elementary. Yes, I had that experience with my middle son just this year. I contacted his teacher to tell her, you know, he had come home and said something that happened, and something about the staff and what they didn't do and how they didn't address it. And so I sent her a message and told her the situation. The first thing she did, she brought up something that he did a week ago that she had never told me about.
Right.
So, and I called her out on it. I said, so are you telling me because I'm bringing up a concern with your staff that you're going to dig back and try to bring up something to counteract it? And, you know, she apologized, but that's what happens. This doesn't just start once the police step in. This is something systemic. Yeah. This is in the system. This is how our Black boys are treated, and our Black girls, but our Black boys especially. And so we have to be mindful of it and call it out when we see it.
And, you know,
well, go ahead. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I think that for me personally, like as a physician, there are so many exams, like we were talking about exams and these assessments that are biased that you have to take to get to certain levels. And with my own son, I noticed with him, particularly during this virtual learning from COVID pandemic, even people from the Detroit public school system, what they're doing versus Detroit public school system versus the West Bloomfield public school system, even the delivery of education has been disproportionately different between districts and the same grade students. And one thing I've noticed too, just in trying to find a school where you, in the Detroit area, you can't get diversity and a high achieving test scoring school. They're inversely related. You have to pick one or the other. And so you either have to sacrifice your child potentially doing one of the choice schools where you have them there and they may be the only in their class. And then that's a whole societal cultural shock in that situation. Or you say, okay, well, I'm going to keep my child at this school because there's diversity, because he's comfortable, but he's not meeting his academic potential. And I think that's another reason kids become bored in these classrooms. And you see it, like, you know, my son, for example, was given online material only, first grade. Wow. Another district, you have the teachers calling, reading with the kids every week, 10, 15 minutes, submitting handwritten assignments. So already right there, this has shown us the disproportionality of everything, which continues to cultivate as you matriculate on. Because at my level, everything I do is based on an assessment. I cannot move from undergrad to medical school without an assessment. I cannot move from medical school to residency without an assessment. Everything is an assessment. I have to learn how to take these exams. This is just what it boils down to. So if I restrict my kids early, I'm gonna limit their trajectory just baseline. So that's just my thoughts on education and how it kind of ties into eventually a child being bored in class, which goes into these behavioral issues, which labels the child, and then it just kind of perpetuates the whole cycle for the rest of his or her life.
I agree with that too. And it's funny, speaking on the educational side of it, and I'm so glad Dr. Taylor is on here too, because one of the things that we collaborated with and partnered with, and it goes right back to what you said, Dr. Statterford, is that, when you start early on in reducing or not exposing kids to proficiencies, that catches up with them later. We're not even talking about college bound. We're talking about even a career. Forget the idea about going to school. We work in commercial skilled trades, for example, and if any of these kids who have very low proficiencies in reading, math, any of the STEM components, when they come out of high school, they don't even have the ability to test for an electrician's test or a plumbing test or an HVAC test, because while they might be good with their hands, they don't have the competencies to pass a written test or even read it for that matter. Now imagine you're not college bound and you can't even stay home and work. That's the sad tragedy of this, and I'm sure Janae will get into this when we start talking about, my friend Robert, because when you look at where he started at third grade and the fact that he was moved through a system, I mean, you wonder, this is almost a trailblazing pattern right into prison based on those third and fourth and fifth grade reading skills. I mean, what are they going to do? And so that, to your point, Dr. Taylor, you are absolutely right. I think sometimes we always look at this after thing, and I wish sometimes we'd almost regress a little bit and go back. And I know, we can't always go back and fix what was wrong, but I think sometimes, we're so busy looking at everything right now and fixing that without understanding what's broke coming down the pathway. And right now we've got a lot of kids who in third and fourth and fifth grade, you might as well trailblaze. And if we don't do something dramatic, something drastic, you might as well, where Robert might come out of prison, trust me, there are a lot more following his pattern, and that's tragic to me.
I want to pick up on what you're saying because I am somewhat new to the Michigan area, but in my experience coming from Indiana and working with youth advisory councils and working with trying to figure out what we're going to do with these youth who are somewhat getting into trouble, but there's no place to put them, and so you can't put them in prison or in jail with adult men, but at the same time you don't have the physical resources geographically to put them anywhere. And so just trying to work with young people. I was very surprised in Indiana, and I know it has to be the same in other places as well, that the sheer number of young children, young black men, young black boys in particular, who are making the decision as to whether they're going to continue with school at grade 5. So a fifth grader, the age of a fifth grader is determining for the rest of their life whether they're going to participate in school, in education. And so if you're not in school, you're getting into trouble. At some point, it's just going to lead to that point. But the reason for that decision-making process is that they feel as though they're not mastering. When Dr. Standiford said there's an assessment, when they can't master the assessment that's ahead of them, they are making decisions as to whether they're going to continue with the school program or not. And that's truly tragic because we know at some point in time, trouble is going to come their way.
So are those incompetencies that Jimmy talked about, are those linked to future racial profiling events for their lives? Because of the incompetency, because they can't articulate well, or because they're not able to have a level of awareness. Talk to us about that.
That's what I mean. Maybe we should redefine that and call it pre-prison. We always talk about prison as it relates to bars, but maybe we should start being a little harsher in our language and talk about what pre-prison looks like. And everything that we've shared on this panel right here, that's a recipe for prison. So, we start looking at fifth and sixth graders and calling it pre-prison. Maybe that's the hard knocks we deserve. But maybe that'll shake us up a little bit, because if you're a functional illiterate adult, you are in a different kind of prison, sans the bars, and the other one is inevitable.
Yeah, I would agree. The prison is poverty, right? And I think the one thing that I constantly sit with is that the investment says what we think about Black children. So I think about growing up in Saginaw. I went to Houghton Elementary School. That was my neighborhood school. And I had some teachers who were extremely invested in my education, who took the extra time, went out, spent their own money on books, because that school wasn't as well resourced as a Handley. And when I eventually transitioned into middle school, the path that I was suggested was go to Saginaw Arts and Sciences Academy, because you're going to get the best education there. And that's within a public school system. So if within a public school system, there is such a drastic disparity between the type of education you receive depending on the school building you're in.
Wow.
I mean, we don't even need to talk about private school, because we can just look at public school and look at the way that it's situated. The school that has all of the access to the AP exams, has access to these specialized courses that teach you to test well, that teach you to navigate the systems you need to navigate. They are special access only within a structure that's meant to be equal access in the first place. So when I think about those structures and those systems, I am undoubtedly better positioned because of the schools that I went to. And I went in and out of SAS at one point, so I could compare going into South in 8th grade and just sitting there, because I was 2 grades ahead in math that they were teaching. And that's within a public school district. It's within the same school district. And when I went to work with students in Grand Rapids Public Schools, they were transitioning to a similar system where you have specialized schools, where the school pipeline is, I think, how they phrased it at the time I was there. The pipeline that was trade related was in the neighborhoods of Black and brown people.
Yeah.
And that communicates everything that needs to be communicated systemically about what your expectations about their trajectory is. When you're saying the schools we're going to automatically send you to are going to teach you to go into the skilled trades only, which there's nothing wrong with that. But is it a choice if that's the only thing you've been taught? I want people to choose their professions. I don't want people to feel like they were stuck going down a path because no one saw any potential for them. And often that's the way we see school structured. And that does build up to the sort of retaliation that leads to negative interactions with the law sometimes, negative interactions with employers.
Well, those are some of the educational disparities that we're facing in the public schools that you look at. So across the bridge, you know, across the bridge, you get a better education than, you know, than those that are in the valley of the bridge, you know. So, and I do believe at some point, you know, anger resonates because people feel like they've been done a disservice, that they have not been given the same opportunities as others. And so in that, they will like, well, the prison starts in their minds like, well, I've already been marked. I'm at a cap. I can't really go any further. So I might as well just join in where it's easier to just do whatever I want to do. And I don't have to follow the rules. I just create my own path. And sometimes it's a path of destruction. And so we seeing our young men having these negative interactions with the police because they're thinking like, it doesn't even matter because I've already been marked. You already see me as an enemy or as an animal or as an incompetent being. So I might as well act as that. So I wonder, if we would, how can we help change the mindset, the mentality of our young men that already feel imprisoned at 5th and 6th grade, that already been profiled, that have already been marked for a life of injustice? What do we do?
I think that we have to stop conditioning children for prison and for every little thing requiring a response of disciplinary action. We have school social workers, we have like the peer pros in Saginaw Public Schools, but there absolutely needs to be, I think, a defined skill set to specifically address children of color who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who have just a range of social and emotional issues that, you know, aren't necessarily paid attention to. And, you know, like I said, not discrediting the school social workers that are currently in the schools, but, you know, you have to be able to look at each child, where they are, where they come from, their background, and, you know, specifically tailor something that benefits them so that they're able to thrive in schools, and so that they don't feel imprisoned and, you know, always disciplined. I think it was mentioned that children are, you know, kind of already on the look like, oh my goodness, I'm going to get in trouble. I used to substitute teach, and I did it for a long time. You had like the groups of Black boys and Hispanic boys. And so they were always on the defense. They described the principal, anybody in a position of authority in their academic setting, as the ops or the feds. If anybody told on them, bro, you the feds, you the ops, and all that. And so I think that ultimately we just have to embrace them and, you know, make them feel safe in their learning spaces and decriminalize the learning spaces.
Sure. You know, I just want to oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I wanted to jump in here. There's a beautiful picture when Obama was the president of a young boy and his family that had gone to visit the Oval Office. And he is just looking up at Barack Obama like he is just a wonderfully beautiful giant, you know, a sight that he has never seen before. And I replay that photograph in my head all the time when I'm thinking about young Black boys in particular. Because I'm a pastor, I have to talk about the church. The church offers for children and young people just wonderful opportunities for learning that plugs into what they're doing from day to day at school. And so, you know, the church will take a young child who is struggling with reading, and through things like Sunday school and tutoring programs and what have you, the retired teachers in a church congregation, the multi-generational atmosphere that faith communities provide can embrace young children and put them in a position where they might feel like they're failing on the outside. Let's get you to the point where you can have enough confidence and champion your self-confidence to a level where, because you're reading more at church, now you can read better at school. Because you're doing more things at church where you're learning leadership, now you don't feel as though everybody's picking on you when you get back to school. And so the church and faith communities play a very valuable part in this education for our children, because it's not just reading, it's not just writing, it's about leadership. It's about, you know, the difference between a nickel and a dime, and making sure that when you come to a place that you are proud of how you look. There is nothing greater, a greater feeling to me than when I see a young boy and he looks at me like I'm Santa Claus. You know, he look at me like I earn $1 million. I don't earn $1 million, but man, when I tie my bow tie, I feel like $1 million. And when I wear my bow tie, I stand taller, my chest out. And so don't believe that our children, especially our young boys, aren't seeing that, and they're wanting to replicate that in themselves.
Yes. And you know what? And I just want to just a little bit, because I want to get into, I want to get back to the police misconduct. And thank you, Reverend LaFoon, for your comments. But I want to, let's talk really quickly. What role does the police misconduct play in mass incarceration? Because that's where a lot of our young men are headed. So what role does the police play in that mass incarceration?
Well, it's huge. I mean, we just can't get past that fact. You know, they're the first, they are the first line. And when that line is dirty, or when that line, it's so vitally important. I mean, especially when you look at our urban communities in particular, there just has to be zero room for misconduct. I mean, we are, you know, I think too often, you know, we get as a community, because we get outraged by police misconduct, somehow we're anti-police. Nothing could be further from the truth. I don't know a single Black person that wants to be in a non-police state. I mean, we want the same sort of protection as everybody else. And that's why it's so vitally important that they get it right. When they get it wrong, the idea that they have a protective body behind them, which leaves them not vulnerable to the same repercussions we do when we misconduct in our own jobs. I don't know many of us who could get away with having that kind of behavior and get off almost literally scot-free. And I think when you look at the police in particular, there's a partnership there. And I sometimes reel back when the idea is that it's on us first. No, when I give you a gun to police a neighborhood, I don't care if it's white, Black, whatever that is, when I give you a gun to carry out law and order, I expect a higher standard. I expect a greater responsibility. You are in a position of authority, and there is very little room for error. And the fact that they make error lends itself right to that misconduct, which feeds into a system. And by then, it goes back to what Brianna said earlier, it is systemic because it becomes embedded. I've always said that when you have misconduct, you lose the right to profile. Like there's no profiling at that point. And they always talk about what's the difference between profiling and stereotyping. Well, it's attitudinal, and attitudinal comes from misconduct. And I don't mind good police work, but when it starts with the color of somebody's skin, that's not good police work. That's lazy. And
so it's race a factor. Is race a factor?
Race is always a factor. It's always a factor.
Is it a factor for the police brutality in the misconduct that's happening now?
Well, I don't think anything should be a factor in that because that almost sounds like an excuse. So I'm careful about using that word. No, there's no excuse for that kind of abuse at all. But I'll let Brianna talk about that because this is her day job. That's her day job. Go ahead, Bree.
Jimmy, I'm going to disappoint you because I will be the first person to say, I agree with everything that you said. When someone has a gun and they are authorized by the state to carry out law using force, they should be held to the highest standard. I don't want a fearful person holding a gun. That said, I do want to see the police abolished because I think about the roots of policing. Police in the US context, they derive from slave patrols. And so in my mind, the police are doing exactly what they were designed to do, harm Black and brown bodies. And so I don't see, I can say as a person that has done some of the institutional work with way too many police departments that there is no fixing it because you can't change the design of something that's operating perfectly. So I think some of the struggle that I have in like these conversations, for example, is personally, I think cops serve no purpose. They don't make any Black people safer. There is not a single Black person that is safer because a cop exists. They respond to violence that has already occurred, which then leads me to the question, if we took all this money we spend giving people military equipment, guns, and put that in education and social welfare programs, we'd probably see, well, not probably, we definitely see greater returns in dealing with these systemic issues that a lack of funding drives up even further. Because systemic racism doesn't start with policing by no means, but it's certainly, the violence of it is more effective when you have a police state. So,
well, why is it so hard?
I hear you, Jimmy.
Well, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard for us to get accountability, and justice in America when there's police misconduct or brutality on a criminal case? Why is that so difficult?
Can I just say something real quick to Brianna's point? There is no way in God's green earth I ever support militarizing a police. That is absolutely unnecessary and ridiculous. So I'm wholeheartedly in agreement with you there.
Well, thank you. And I think the accountability piece is, oh, I'm sorry, Janae, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, why would you hold someone accountable that did exactly what you wanted them to do?
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yep.
Wow, that.
I was letting Janae talk. She's getting ready to say something. Go ahead, Janae.
I wanted to point out the fact that accountability is challenging because there are so many protections afforded to police officers. There's a lot of vagueness and a lot of discretionary language used in the laws and statutes, sometimes by a standard of what a reasonable person would do. Well, a reasonable person would think that, oh, they had a gun. A reasonable person would think that they were getting ready to run. And maybe if they ran, they would come back with something to attack the officer. And so there's a lot of discretion, a lot of language that allows these officers to conduct their or discharge their duties very subjectively. And
Yes.
so until the subjectiveness is done away with, there's always going to be room for officers to come up with reasons as to why they feared for their lives, what their beliefs were when they encountered a potential suspect. And so it's about the vagueness and the far-reaching discretion that these different officers and officials possess.
I think that there's also it's difficult to get accountability when you've got this idea of two Americas. Before the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, people act like they had no clue, no idea as to what was going on, that police abuse of Black and brown peoples was even an issue. And so you've got this awakening almost of an entire nation and the world, because you had protests in all 50 states of the United States and in over 18 countries around the world. So you had this mass awakening, as if the fact that nobody knew or paid attention to the fact that Blacks have been crying out for years, decades, and that all of a sudden there's this point where everybody's eyes are open at the same time, everybody's ears are open at the same time, and you're looking at a response that this nation has never seen.
So how do we end the mass incarceration if we don't have the accountability, if we don't have the level of awareness that drives us back to the facts and what the obvious is? Then how can we even talk about ending mass incarceration? How can we even do that?
You're asking everybody that?
I am asking everyone that.
And you know, this is important. It's an important discussion because, I don't disagree with anything that Breonna said. And that's what's so interesting about this, because I accept it for what it's worth. But at the same time, I am never going to acquiesce to what is. That's just not in my DNA. I agree in principle with that. But the fact of the matter is, I know what happened before and I know what's happening today. There is a level of accountability I can expect. Now, mind you, that might be fantasy land, but at the same time, we're paying people to do this job. So you either hold them to that standard, even if in fact you have the worst idea that it'll even happen, you can't. I think the moment you drop your guard and the moment you say, well, it just is what it is, and it goes back to what you were saying before, Breonna, about systemic racism, that becomes an enabler. Well, that nobody's going to fight it. I think these loud voices, and I think the idea that what happened with George Floyd has changed the tenor. And I'm not saying we're going to fix this overnight, mind you, but there's a level I expect, and I think all of us should expect, that we hold officers to. I get it. They got union contracts. They've got this, they've got that. But and I get it. And they've always had that. But the moment we go, well, that's the way it is, well, that's the way it'll always be. And so maybe incremental, maybe it's the slightest, the littlest things that start to make change. And I may never see it in my lifetime, granted. I don't expect to see that perfection, but I do expect, like anything else, all of us on this panel, we have one common goal here, and that's to leave this world better than we found it. And so if it means planting a seed that maybe something in Saginaw changes, and I think sometimes we look at the world and it's so damn big that it's hard to eat that. But if we look at our simple zip codes and hold ourselves to that, if I hold Saginaw Township and Saginaw City to a standard, to an accountability. That is my world. And I think when you condense the world down to your zip code, success, accountabilities, they bleed out. And so that's what I mean. So when you, Brianna, when you brought up your points, I'm nodding in agreement with you, but I either make a decision that I either have to fight that or I have to acquiesce to it. And for me, I'm just going to fight it. I'm going to fight it every single day.
Yes. Awesome. Anyone else? Thank you, Jimmy.
I think you almost end up with a both and situation when it comes to how do you keep people from being incarcerated,
Yes.
which is you do the early stuff where you're investing in family. So I often see a lot of foundations, and I feel like I've been very critical because much of my career was spent in the foundation world. Explain to funders why when you are funding programs or work that only directs resources to a child and doesn't look at resourcing their families, what good is this one sack lunch that we're sending home with a child if the rest of the family is starving?
Cool.
And so we have to start dealing with the systemic issues that reduce people's quality of life. Because I personally know that in my ideal world of abolishing police, that is going to take time, but I can start to take some money away while we figure out how to rewrite some of these city charters, how to release the hold that police unions seem to have on any sort of substantive change or accountability work in most cities and municipal governments. But you can deal with how communities build supports. So
sure.
I often think about mutual aid funds that have existed prior to this moment we're in, and the number of mutual aid support systems. So for people not familiar with mutual aid, it is essentially communities coming together to fund needs within the community. So someone needs help paying their rent, someone needs money to buy groceries. There have been a number of localized, resident-led initiatives around the country to help people make ends meet, particularly because COVID is overlapping with a crisis moment in movement work, right? So when people are sitting at home and they're forced to witness and then process because they can't leave, they can't escape thinking about the moment they find themselves in. This is one of those moments where more people are like, actually, I do have a responsibility to make sure someone isn't starving right now because they can't work. Because I think people are more sympathetic to it because they can imagine themselves in that situation being out of work long enough because of COVID. Whereas before, people weren't as empathetic to human suffering. And so I think now that we know that more people are witnessing someone else's health outcomes directly affects theirs.
Yes.
More work is being done to deal with some of those pieces that actually do influence the school to prison pipeline. If the family is taken care of, we know a child is less likely to end up on a trajectory to prison. So I think that communities taking more responsibility for taking care of one another is definitely work that people can proactively be doing. Are you checking on your neighbor? Are you checking on your church members? I grew up in a really supportive church. St. Luke took care of their members. And I know that my success is directly tied to the network of people that made sure I was okay. And I think that there's been fissures in that over the last couple of decades that need to be rebuilt while we deal with these broken systems, right? While we deal with these systems that need to be abolished. So I think we can all do both. And I think everyone in this chat certainly is doing work that affects that through line. But I think the idea that we wait for one thing to happen before we do the others is often where people get stuck. It's like, no, still do this other work while we're over here fixing this other stuff too.
Well, you mentioned COVID-19, and I just want to ask this last question to the panel before we transition into our part 2 discussion. You mentioned COVID-19. So COVID-19 in the Michigan Department of Corrections prison has been trending for several weeks now, right? So how vulnerable are prisoners to COVID-19 and why?
Proximity. No question about it.
Absolutely.
It's the density. I mean, I don't care if from here to India, every single person has talked about that. Even when you look at the inner cities, you know, New York, Chicago, Detroit, you look at places like that. I mean, it's density, you know, the fact that we live in hugely dense communities. I mean, there's no accident in that. Now you enclose in a prison system. I mean, who's surprised by that? You know, I don't have an answer to that. I truly don't, but I certainly, I'm not shocked by it by any stretch.
Well, what measures do you think that we can take to keep our prisoners safe?
I'd better let the doctors answer that.
All right.
I mean, largely what we tell, to be honest, I don't know. And me and Attorney Lamar talked about this because patients coming in with COVID-19, for example, if you're a patient that has mild symptoms, I discharge you. My discharge instructions are you need to quarantine for at least 14 days, which I think should honestly be a lot longer. Quarantine meaning you're staying isolated in a space away from other people so that you can reduce your risk of spread.
Sure.
I don't feasibly see how that can happen in a prison system where your room, your bunkmate, you guys are not even 2 feet apart from each other.
Exactly.
So I don't feasibly see that. I think that transmission in general of COVID is something that we're trying to understand on a daily basis, as well as the replication of the virus. Right now, we've seen that it has replicated. The strain has. I think testing, like you have to test. Like there has to. I understand that there's symptom-based testing, and then there's the asymptomatic transmission of it. And I just think everybody needs to be tested. And I don't really know. I tried to do a little research on how many cases there are. I think there's about 48,000 cases of COVID confirmed positives in the prison population. And I think about almost 4,000 cases in the prison population in Michigan, and about 68 deaths that we've had. However, if you look, you're not sure if these prisons all of them are reporting. It looks like we don't have 100% reporting from all prisons. So that's the issue right there. I don't think we have true numbers. But going back to reducing the spread, I don't know. I don't want to say make the prisons bigger. I want to say let's reduce the people going in. Let's get the people out that can come out.
Sure.
Come home and maybe have some housing where they're in a safer space, but you have to reduce the volume in these spaces. Particularly African Americans, I have seen a disproportionate effect of COVID on African Americans. And I think that the general population views it as a respiratory illness. No, COVID-19 has affected the cardiac system. It's affected the kidney system. It's affected everything. Blood clots everywhere. We don't know a lot about this virus. And I think that's what makes it even more dangerous and makes it a situation that we have to do something about very urgent.
I want to say something political, and I think it's vitally important. You know, people have worked tirelessly to get the kind of voice or face of their politics into office. And when you look at a situation like this, you now have Governor Whitmer, who's in office, who's predisposed toward democratic issues and or Black interests in that, for that effect. There's no question in my mind that there should be a pounding on the door that there is an immediate review of nonviolent criminals who are locked up in the prison system to be released. Because this is, I mean, all of us, I don't care damn what your politics are, this is inhumane. When you can't move out of the way of a harm that's inflicted everybody around the world, it's inhumane. The idea that somebody's in there for selling weed or pills, or I mean the non-violent passing a bad check, there should be an immediate review, and people should be demanding that right away. I mean, does it fix everything? No, but does it clear some space? Yeah, it does. And when you talk about mass incarceration, the question then is who's incarcerated? You know, not just, you know, not everybody murdered somebody. I'm certainly not giving a clean slate to people who need to be there. I don't want to live next to them. But I'm saying that when you have this nonviolent situation, the fact that there aren't review boards that are working tirelessly to get people the hell out of there, and you know what's sad about it? That's what Trump's doing. He's got people being released. I mean, his lawyer or the ex-lawyer. I mean, you've seen people clean the prison system out on a federal basis so they can go home away from COVID. Politics matters. It always has, it always will. And this is the chance right now for people to use their political power to get folks out of prison.
Yeah, you know what? That this really leads me right into some other statistics that I want to share with our audience. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you so much. You've led me right where I was trying to go. Because see, according to the National Registry of Exonerations, African Americans are only 13% of the American population, but the majority of the innocent defendants are wrongfully convicted of crimes and later exonerated. So, right in the ballpark of what you were talking about. And so they constitute 40% of the 1,900 exonerations listed in the National Registry of Exonerations. And that's as of October 2016. And so the majority of more than 1,800 innocent defendants who were framed and convicted of crimes in 15 large scale police scandals and later cleared in group exonerations, right? So we know the names, right? We know the names of the cases of the police brutality that made national headlines both over the years and recently with Michael Brown, George Floyd, and Rayshard Brooks. But there are those names that we don't hear that often, like an Aaron Salter or Desmond Ricks or Dwight Love that we're not all familiar with. But ironically enough, these are all the exonerations that are included in the police misconduct from Detroit, Michigan, where we have numerous scandals. And I think many of you all of you on this panel have heard of some type of police scandal that's happened recently, later in the media, including the wrongful convictions and the crime labs, right, being shut down in 2008, and the Detroit Police Department being accused of excessive force, and we had just saw that on national television with George Floyd, right, and then the false arrests and the illegal detentions and the unconstitutional conditions of confinement. So this is where we're going. Just as Jimmy had talked about earlier, he mentioned Robert Hines. And so let me talk to you a little bit about him, who is a juvenile lifer. He's a native of Detroit, Michigan. And again, his name is Robert Hines, and he had fallen into that category of where he should not even be in prison. Okay, so he was arrested in 2001 for the murder of Damon King, and he was later convicted and sentenced to life, y'all, in prison without parole at 17 years old, right? And so, of course, he's maintained his claims of innocence, and with the help of supporters and people like us that are on the panel, and we're talking about these issues. And then that miscellaneous file, the miscellaneous file that the Detroit Police Department failed to uncover. And so it was wrongfully withheld for 19 years from the trial attorney. And it contained evidence of this man being innocent. And then if you were able to read some of the information in the report, there were several testimonial inconsistencies, right? The police misconduct, the disturbing actions taken by law enforcement in the criminal justice system. I mean, it just absolutely left me speechless. And not to mention the families of the men that have been wrongfully incarcerated, and they're being taken away from loved ones, their future being taken away. So let's address more of the broad scope of the police misconduct. And we're going to talk about some of those details of Robert Hines' case and the exoneration application, which is currently pending with the Wayne County Conviction Integrity Unit. So can we just have a picture of Robert posted on the video? If we can just bring him up really quick here. And so that's Robert Hines. And just I had mentioned all the facts about him. He's 36 years old, he's Detroit native, and he's a lifer. I mean, he wasn't even given a fair trial, And so this is our brother, this is our nephews, this is our fathers, these are our uncles, these are our sons, that I'm talking about, right? So one thing I think is important to mention about what happened to Robert Hines is some of the behind the scenes things that happened that put him in position to be wrongfully convicted. So the one thing I want to mention is that David Pausch, the same man who fabricated evidence in the case of Desmond Ricks, who is exonerated 25 years later, he's the same person who worked on Robert Hines' case in 2001. However, the cases that were decided to be reviewed that he worked on only went back to 2004. So there were at least 15 other men in prison right now that Robert Hines has the names of, who David Pausch worked on their cases, but they were never reviewed. So these men haven't ever been contacted. And so I'm just curious if someone in the justice system, you know, have been proven to be unethical and deceitful and to lie. So why wouldn't every case they worked on be called into question? So I want to read this really quick. So in the Detroit Free Press, there was an article about two men in Detroit who were recently freed from prison due to the police misconduct, dated back to March 25th, 2020. And so the Wayne County prosecutor, Kim Worthy, said, and I quote, "These cases take time to review, and we find tainted or fraudulent evidence," Worthy said. So, I mean, do you believe that after reviewing all the evidence of the Wayne County prosecutor's office will exonerate Robert? Do you? So let's look at some of the exhibits, if we could just bring those up. And I want Attorney Lamar to join me in this as we review some of the exhibits and we talk about what they mean. So what was the prosecution's theory in Mr. Hines' case?
The crux of the prosecutor's theory in Robert's case was that it was not a random act of robbery.
Mm-hmm.
And so the issue with that theory is that upon Robert's discovery of the miscellaneous file, you find in the miscellaneous file, you know, not just a general search for police reports, but in the miscellaneous file, you find police reports where there were break-ins and robberies at the victim's home that occurred prior to him being killed. And so the police reports that were in the file, they would have debunked the prosecutor's theory by showing that, you know, there were other people, there had been previous attacks and threats of violence toward this particular victim. And it, you know, it would have undermined the prosecution's reliance on the fact that at trial, Robert was painted as this perpetrator that wanted to assassinate someone to be a part of a rap group.
So where were the documents to support Mr. Hines' claims of the innocence discovered?
So the documents were discovered in Detroit Police Department's miscellaneous case file. That case file, Robert hadn't seen prior to trial. He didn't see it at trial. He didn't see it during trial. And so there were multiple FOIA requests. It's the Freedom of Information Act, where these requests were made to obtain this particular file. The requests were denied, and ultimately litigation ensued to finally obtain the file. And so all while the case is being investigated throughout trial to the conclusion of trial, Robert doesn't receive this miscellaneous case file until about 12 years after he's been convicted of murder.
So So who was the prosecutor in Mr. Hines' case?
The prosecutor responsible for Robert's conviction, her name is Christine Kowal, and she's yet a prosecutor in Wayne County.
And so what are her duties as a prosecutor in Mr. Hines' case?
There's a number of duties that prosecutors have individually, and then there's also some duties that we as attorneys, whether you're defense or the prosecution has, and I'll go through some of those. There's a case called Brady v. Maryland. That case was decided in 1963, well before Robert was ever convicted. And then there's a long line of cases that follow. Sure. Brady basically sets out that prosecutors have a duty to disclose evidence, whether it is exculpatory or whether it's inculpatory. Exculpatory evidence is favorable evidence tending to exonerate or prove a defendant's innocence. Inculpatory evidence is the evidence that tends to prove guilt. And so it doesn't matter if the evidence is favorable. If the evidence is not favorable, it needs to be disclosed when the defense attorney makes a demand for discovery or a request for discovery. Disclosing the evidence is necessary because you are entitled to the right to a fair trial. Sure. And so straight across the board, point blank period, this miscellaneous case file that comes up 12, 13 years after Robert's conviction, it's without a doubt evidence that he did not receive a fair trial. And so back to the prosecutor's duties, there's a case that provides the ruling that prosecutors cannot offer perjured testimony, and I'll get into that a little bit later.
Sure.
Michigan has its own rules of professional conduct, specifically Rule 3.8, which provides that prosecutors have a duty, if they discover material evidence, credible evidence after the fact, they have a duty to disclose that to the court. And they also have a duty to investigate whether or not the defendant is actually innocent. Sure. Prosecutors, attorneys in general have a duty to be diligent. They have a duty to demonstrate candor toward the tribunal, meaning that you're always truthful before the court. You cannot offer false evidence. And there's a number of there's a number of duties that prosecutors have. The main one being turning over the evidence. And you can't hide evidence. You can't fabricate evidence because it's a deprivation of 14th Amendment rights.
Absolutely, absolutely. So how do the documents, regarding the home invasions and the perpetrators wearing attire with DPD on it affect the prosecution's theory or statements?
In its simplest terms, it just shows that it very well could have been another random act of robbery, because in one of those reports, the victim was tied up and just a lot of things happened. And so basically it could have been another random act of robbery.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. And so what was Christine Kowal's? What was she responsible for knowing and disclosing evidence in the Detroit Police Department's possession?
So going back to case law, the cases that follow Brady, Christine Kowal had a duty to disclose everything that Robert found in the miscellaneous police file. That duty remains the prosecution's burden, even if they claim they didn't know that the documents and the other the other evidence existed. Christine Kowal had a duty to know what documentary evidence, what physical evidence, anything that Detroit police suppressed or withheld or maintained. She had a duty to know that, and she had a duty to disclose that so that Robert would have had a fair trial.
I mean, this is where the rubber meets the road. I mean, was the DNA evidence presented in Mr. Hines' case?
There was some DNA evidence presented at trial. And so the serologist, her name was Paula Lytle, and she was the head of the Detroit Crime Lab before it was shut down in 2008. She testified at Robert's trial that Robert could not be excluded from the DNA evidence.
Sure.
And the judge clarified, well, neither can I, neither can anyone else in the courtroom. And so the confusion surrounding that, the fact that it wasn't driven home that nobody could be excluded from the DNA,
right,
much kind of landed Robert in a position to where the jury didn't really know what to do with it. And so without getting off topic too much, we have later down the line where Robert takes the case to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals says that Robert is linked to linked to the crime by DNA evidence, which absolutely wasn't true. At no point during the trial was there ever any conclusive DNA evidence that linked Robert to the crime scene.
Right. And then, you know, because I've read the report as well, and this is what I wanted to ask, you know, was there any DNA testing presented to Mr. Hines regarding the testing of any hair follicles?
No, and Robert didn't know that a hair follicle existed until the miscellaneous file was uncovered. Basically, upon seeing that, you know, you see a hair follicle, it's like, well, oh my goodness, you tested the DNA on the bandanas, you tested the DNA on, you know, these other pieces of evidence. Why didn't we get any tests for this particular hair follicle? Probably because it would have proved that Robert did not perpetrate the crime he was convicted of.
Exactly. So really at any point during Mr. Hines' case, did the police officer testify there was no fingerprint evidence?
Yes, and so we'll go back to May 2001 when the victim was murdered.
Okay.
In May 2001, there were fingerprints taken by the sergeant who testified at Robert's trial. His name is Sergeant Vincent Vogel, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but you got the name. And
right.
So in May, he's the person whose name is actually on the fingerprint request. His name is on the, there's a request for fingerprints, and then there's a print search, and his name is attached to both of those. And so we have the preliminary exam that occurs in August of 2001, where he gets up and testifies that there was no fingerprint evidence. And what's unique about that particular situation with the fingerprints is that there was a search completed that said Robert's fingerprints did not match the print search that was completed.
Yep.
And it's this one, it's Exhibit B, page 2 of 2. And if you go to the bottom, it says complaint checked. The victim and suspect with negative results. So they have fingerprints and they didn't match Robert's.
Wow. Wow. So a witness named Timothy Shaw provided a statement to law enforcement when this witness initially gave his statement to law enforcement. So did the witness mention Mr. Hines?
So initially, when Timothy Shaw gave a statement to Detroit Police Department, he did not mention Robert at all. And the interesting thing about Timothy Shaw's testimony is that he testifies that he heard gunshots in the basement. So this particular witness was actually in the home when the murder occurred.
Right.
So he testifies that he heard gunshots at trial. This is testimony at trial. Prior to trial, he testifies that he didn't hear anything because he was in the basement recording music with his headphones on. He then goes on to testify that when he heard the gunshots, he jumped behind the couch and he went upstairs after he heard him leave. Him in air quotes as a particular quote. And so his testimony gets very muddled because one, it's on the record. Timothy Shaw actually admits to lying about his statement given to Detroit police, and then about his statement given at trial. And so when he first gave his statement, another thing that he said was that he discovered the victim's body because he went upstairs to use the bathroom. And so it's actually the prosecution pulled this particular fact out and asked him if he was being truthful about his statement, and, you know, fleshed out why he wasn't being truthful about it. And so at that moment, I believe that's when Christine Kowal, that's when her duty to, you know, take a closer look at the case, specifically being diligent and demonstrating candor toward the tribunal. I don't understand why it was acceptable for a totally different narrative, strikingly different from what was given to the police, to come out just a day and night difference at trial.
Right. So at what point did Mr. Shaw implicate Mr. Hines?
He didn't implicate Robert until it was time for trial. And so, you know, that's something that we shouldn't just glance over. And Timothy Shaw, he isn't the only witness that gave testimony that implicated Robert at trial, but not prior to trial.
So did this particular witness make any admissions regarding his own untruthfulness?
Yes, and throughout Timothy Shaw's testimony, when you read through his testimony, so basically, because the court recorder doesn't record pauses or, you know, tears or heavy breathing or anything like that, or emotion. And so upon reading through the trial transcripts, it's my understanding that there was a lot of pausing, a lot of hesitation in his testimony. And basically with Timothy Shaw, he one admits that he was lying, but then it just goes back to the changing of the stories over and over again. He changed the story, and you know, ultimately admitted to not being truthful about first giving a statement regarding the murder.
Sure. Now there was a lineup, correct?
There was a lineup.
And was Mr. Hines identified in the lineup?
No, he wasn't. There was another person picked out of the lineup that didn't match Robert's description, but yet and still Robert's in prison.
So one of the key witnesses for the prosecution was Stephen Kirk, also known as Michael Stein, because he used an alias. So Mr. Stein, what was his role in the prosecution's case against Mr. Hines?
He was the prosecution's key witness, and basically linked Robert to the crime, to the vehicle that was found at the scene of the crime. It was his testimony that the prosecution used to convict Robert. Mr. Kirk, or Stephen Kirk, I'm sorry, Michael Stein, AKA Stephen Kirk, he testified that a white man named Robert Rex took Robert to Kmart to purchase ammunition. And the motive for this particular witness to get up on the stand and lie was because there was a credible witness that actually indicated that he saw this particular witness in the car that the witness claims Robert was in. And in addition to that, I just wanted to note that Robert Rex, who owned the vehicle, this is someone who was strung out on drugs, had alcohol addiction, substance abuse addiction. He was actually high at the time that he took whoever to Kmart, and he testified that that it was Robert that he took to Kmart, but later gave a description that matched Michael Stein, also known as Stephen Kirk.
You know, I just kind of want to backpedal back about the miscellaneous file that took 4 years for him to get And that was withheld from his defense attorney. Talk to us about that.
So in that file, I think some of the exhibits have already been shown. There was the hair follicle, there were police reports, there were fingerprint results indicating that they did not belong to Robert. Let's see, there was a tip sheet where the tip sheet stated that a man named Earl was a suspect. And when we get back into the trial transcripts, this person named Earl was actually with the victim right before he was killed. And so the affidavits are significant too. But basically, the miscellaneous file, it is a compilation of everything proving Robert's innocence, because he's always maintained his innocence. He just didn't have the actual evidence to prove it. But ultimately, it contains everything that's necessary to free him. And one of the things that is unique about Robert's case is that you don't even have to do a lengthy investigation to exonerate him. The fact that he wasn't given a fair trial is enough in itself.
And this happens all the time with the Detroit Police Department. Am I correct?
Yes. Years and years and years of officer misconduct. There have been lawsuits. There have been just a lot of, I guess for lack of better words, crazy happenings surrounding the revealing of these miscellaneous files, because Robert isn't the only one that had a miscellaneous file. There's a number of exonerees as well as people currently incarcerated that have miscellaneous files that they never saw prior to their pending trials. And so the corruption, the fabrication, the planting of drugs, you see a huge amount of police conduct in those miscellaneous case files, and we don't know for the life of us why the misconduct was so widespread and why these individuals were chosen, to take the fall and frame.
Sure. And I want to ask you this very last question. And panel, I want you to get ready because I want you to have an opportunity to give your final remarks. So who is responsible for the error that caused the courts to think that he was linked through DNA evidence and can explain the error?
Who's responsible and who can explain?
Yes.
I think the responsibility falls on Christine Kowal as the prosecutor in this matter. The responsibility falls on the Detroit Police Department because, like I said, widespread corruption, the withholding of case files. And so that's who it falls on. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office and the Detroit Police Department, those are the two bodies that are responsible for Robert's wrongful conviction. And what was the second part of the question?
Oh, and the second part is, so through the DNA evidence, can you explain the error?
The error with the DNA evidence? Mm-hmm. So DNA is not my specialty. And it's overwhelmingly confusing because you got DNA testing that's outdated. You got DNA testing that, people don't even understand. With Robert's case, the serologist, she couldn't conclude, she couldn't factually state that the DNA was actually Robert's. And so, DNA testing, how it's presented, even how it's interpreted is extremely subjective from what I've seen, because if you say Robert wasn't excluded, that automatically makes you think, oh, well, it's his DNA. And so the DNA portion, Detroit Crime Lab was for sure responsible for factual testing. They were responsible for minimizing the margin of error and reporting any, if there was any. And ultimately, they were responsible for saying the evidence is inconclusive or
Right.
the evidence is conclusive. And that statement was never given on the record.
Yeah, the appeal attorney made a mistake in the statement of facts. So, so what I want to just ask you really quick. So is Robert Hines innocent, and what's the status of his exoneration case?
Yes, I do believe that Robert is innocent. And I mean, aside from the fact that he didn't get a fair trial, yes, I believe in his innocence. Because, you know, reading the trial transcripts, it's tedious, it's a lot there, but I think a fifth grader could read it and see that he didn't do this. There's a lot of discrepancies. There's a lot of things that just didn't make sense at trial. There's a lot that wasn't clarified. And so, yes, Robert is innocent, and I can't wait until, you know, justice is served and he's actually released from prison.
And the status of his exoneration case, just really, really quick. I know we're moving close to wrap up, so yes.
Certainly. So Robert's application was submitted to Wayne County's Conviction Integrity Unit at the end of March.
Mm-hmm.
And the most recent article where Robert's case was featured, the representative from the Conviction Integrity Unit indicated that no work had been done on the file. So at this time, the application is pending. What I can let everyone know is that they are going to review it. Because, you know, there's been conversations, and I can't go into a specific detail about it, but the case will be reviewed.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving us additional information concerning Mr. Robert Hines' case, because really at the end of the day, we need to get him back on this side.
Absolutely.
Am I right? So panelists, thank you so much for your insights earlier and just contributing to the conversation. I wish we had more time because this type of conversation takes time, but right now we're planting the seeds and we're putting the information in place where people can discover it and they can raise to another level of awareness about people like Robert Hines. So here's my question for you as we get ready to wrap up. What will be the future of our country in the Black community in 50 years if efforts geared towards prison reform are unsuccessful and mass incarceration continues? And I'll ask one more time, what will be the future of our country in the Black community in 50 years if efforts geared towards prison reform are unsuccessful and mass incarceration continues? If everyone could answer. You got about 60 seconds.
I'll start off here, and I'll be very brief. I think we'll see more of the same, and we'll see more of these unwritten rules in terms of what it means to have systemic racism. I just wanted to share a quote, and then I'm done. Received a Facebook this morning that there was a quote from Pamela Leo, and it says that children need at least one person in their life who thinks the sun rises and sets on them, who delights in their existence and loves them unconditionally. I think as we continue to see more and more of this, people taking our part to champion and mentor our young people so that they don't find themselves making the decision to drop out of school and to get into whatever is available to them that we know will at some point land them in prison.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I've had some conversations with my mom and other older adults who have lived through some things, you know, back in the 60s or what have you. And the one thing I keep hearing them say is that they never thought that they would see where it appears that our country is going backwards. And so if we continue and have unsuccessful, you know, in regards to reform, what we're seeing now, I think, is probably just the beginning. It's going to get worse. And someone mentioned earlier that we all have an obligation to want to leave the world a better place than what we found it. And if those reforms aren't successful, and if we don't actively start doing something, all of us can do something within our realms of control. But if we don't actively do something, I see it getting worse for the Black community.
I'll wrap up real quick. I think that unsuccessfully, you'll see lots of Robert Hines, lots. And I'm glad I won't be around. If we are successful, we'll have the world that Breonna wants. And I'll leave that right there.
All right, who's next?
Agreed. I think it'll just get worse. Like that's all that will happen if things don't change, essentially.
Okay. All right.
I think, I don't know. I don't envision a scenario where people stop burning things down until things change. I think this generation has had enough. And I think the way that we sustain the momentum, my husband and I talk often and frequently about the importance of historical education. So the more people understand about the past, the more likely they are to understand how not to replicate it in the future. And so I think looking at curriculums that school districts approve where kids don't receive next to any civics education, so they don't understand that they need to not elect that prosecutor that puts innocent people in prison, or that they need to stop electing these council members who give police unlimited budgets and don't hold police accountable when they have the power to. I think that is the next part of the work. I don't see a scenario where we can't go back to where we were before because we all witnessed this. And I think the difference between before and the difference that we're in now is that none of us could escape seeing what was happening around us. And I think at least young people will hold us voting adults accountable for the things that we don't do. And I think that they're tired enough of, and they don't, and the thing is, people without power are always going to push more. And I think that it's important for us to, I think a lot about being 30 now and being that adult that people are pointing at, like, what are you doing? And I think we need more of that. And the accountability has to happen to us in our 30s, and the accountability has to happen above us and below us. I think we have to create this cycle of accountability so that we don't go backwards and that things do actually change. Because I don't think that we are that far away from change. People couldn't imagine abolishing the police, and now we're having real conversations about a world where people don't have guns put to their head for walking down the street.
Yes, very good, very good. All right, Attorney Lamar. Then we're gonna go to our call of action. Oh no, go ahead.
Sorry. Ultimately, if things don't change, we're going to, like Jimmy said, continue to see more Roberts. We're going to continue to see the collateral consequences of criminal conviction, voter rights issues, impoverished neighborhoods, families being torn apart. Just basically a continued threat of injustice if reform doesn't help and if mass incarceration continues.
Wonderful. Well, again, I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you and those who are joining. Thank you. I apologize that we ran a little over, but as you can imagine, it's a massive amount of information. And I was trying to get it all in. We were trying to get it all in. It's just impossible in one setting, but just spreading the table and preparing a meal for someone else to eat and be able to indulge in and see what it is that they need to do next. So saying all of that, let's look at our call to action. If you would just share our screen really quick, we all can play a part in helping a Robert Hines. We all can be a voice. We all can stand on the front line when we, especially when we understand that an injustice has taken place and is still taking place, and some of them are silent and some of them are vocal. But what can you do to help? What are some ways that you can make a difference? Sign the petition. Sign the petition. The at this link right here below. You should be able to see that, or a number, or you can join the Life to a Life urban initiative. You can be a part of the advocacy team, or you can make a donation to Robert's legal fees. So there's 3 different ways that you can play a part. But listen, we need you. We need you to help us set this man free. And think about it. If this was your father, if this was your brother, if this was your nephew, if this were your son, if this were a student that you mentored or you educated or whatever, he's all in that one type of person. Think of that. And so let's find a way where we can make a difference. And the first way to make a difference is to choose where you're going to show up. We need you to show up today. And so that's all I have. And I thank you and I appreciate you for your time. And please, 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 please don't let this fall on deaf. Share this. Do it as soon as we close this meeting. Find a way that you're going to make a difference. Show up today. And I thank you again for your participation. I thank you for joining in with us for this virtual town hall meeting.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.